I'm brutally pragmatic. You know what I mean? I want to figure out what is absolutely the cleanest and fastest path. The thing that they've heard repeatedly is KISS.
Yeah.
Keep it simple, stupid.
Well, Srini, thank you so much for taking the time to have this conversation. I've been looking forward to this for quite a while now. For the audience at home, Srini is the co-founder and now co-CEO of Atai Life Sciences, where he actually started as the chief scientific officer.
Correct.
But before me jumping in, I'd love for maybe you to just give an intro as to your career and how you ended up doing all this.
Perfect. Well, Brandon, thank you so much for the opportunity. Really looking forward to it. So my career has been has taken a number of interesting twists and turns along the way. Grew up in a very small town in Kentucky called Whitesburg. Went to the local high school. Managed to get into Yale. That wouldn't happen at this point, but back then I was able to get into Yale and was actually going to go into physics as my major. Switched to computer engineering. Decided I really liked that application bit. And that's obviously going to come up a few times here. That's going to be salient later. Did a lot of work in digital signal processing. Did actually a master's in digital signal processing. But everything I'd done was really biomedically oriented. And so what became apparent during the undergrad and the master's was that there was a disconnect in the language people speak. So I had done the pre-med anyway, so then I ended up applying for an MD PhD program, got into the same one at Yale, and did neuropharmacology there. So really focused on wiring and certain aspects of cognition. In fact, all the circuitry and some of the pharmacology that's relevant to one of our compounds is focused on cognitive impairment schizophrenia.
Right.
A lot of that actually was one of the reasons I was intrigued by that. And then the indication as well as the compound was based on the work I'd done during my PhD thesis.
Oh, wow.
Yeah.
I'm sure we're going to touch on that in a second here.
Yeah.
But before we get there, I'd love for you to just maybe tell us the story about how you ended up starting Atai, and especially I know that you and Florian are halfway across the world from each other. So how did this come to be?
Yeah, so Atai really started more as a fund initially.
Okay.
It wasn't an operating company. So Christian Eidermeyer has a number of these family offices, and that's really what Atai most closely resembled initially. And the initial investment was in Compass.
Yeah.
And the second investment was a company called Perception. And Perception, one of the co-founders is a guy named Jay Kranzler. And he was my very first boss in the industry.
Right.
So that's how... and he reached out to me to actually see if I would be interested in being CEO of Perception. Then when I met the team at Atai, which was Lars, Christian, Florian, it just made more sense for me to join at the Atai level, particularly given the ambitions of turning Atai from a fund into an operating company.
Yeah.
And that's obviously what I was very instrumental in.
Yeah. And tell me about that. So it wasn't the initial vision for it to be an operating company. What was that transition like?
Yeah, I think some of that predated me to some degree.
Okay.
Right. So there had been a number. So again, this was around early 2018 or so.
Yeah.
By the time towards the end of 2019, there was definitely an ambition to invest in more companies.
Right.
And hence Perception. But right around the beginning of 2019, I started talking to and working with Florian right around the beginning of 2019. And, we talked about different models and different approaches, and it just made more sense to kind of bring more people on. And so very quickly thereafter, I officially joined in April of 2019, but I was working very closely with them before. And then there was other people that came on to chief medical officer and a few others to really make it an operating company.
What made more sense about that?
The ability to actually take a range of ideas that are early stage and actually do something with them, bring them to an inflection point yourself.
Yeah.
So what we found was that there were a lot of companies like Cures and other things that were really formed by academics that were very tiny. It's like one or two people. They didn't have the breadth of expertise needed to take the drug into clinic. And it didn't make sense for a small company like that to have all those people, right?
Yeah.
I mean, this was a model by which we could take these things and we could leave the folks that knew the company, the asset the best within the ecosystem.
Yeah.
But then we could drag and drop people into it.
Yeah.
With the requisite expertise, whether that's formulation or manufacturing the actual drug substance, or indeed prepping for a clinical study.
Yeah. Now, one of the things that kind of came up in my kind of background research here is how much your engineering background has influenced the way you think about drug development, company building a biotech. I'd love to just hear from you how that influence has kind of manifested.
Well, it goes back to what I said, initially. It started with engineering, but then I did the PhD. Then I realized I really didn't like the sort of, the nebulousness of a pure academic research.
Right.
I did my internship, realized that clinical medicine was really not for me. So that was like kind of the nadir. I wasn't really sure where I wanted to go at that point. And then got introduced to that person, Jay Kranzler, through an alumni connection. He was also Yale MD PhD, but about 10 years earlier. And it really kind of gelled because this was application, right? That is what engineering is about, right? There's science that's been put together from different sources, but then how do you solve a real world problem? And the real world problem here is all the indications. How do you get something to a patient? How do you get this compound to the doctor? How do you actually treat people? So it was a wonderful way of pulling it all together for me.
Yeah. And how do you think that maybe changes the way that you approach this relative to maybe like some of your contemporaries?
Yeah, I mean, again, I think the team's probably bored of hearing it, but I'm brutally pragmatic.
Okay, yeah.
You know what I mean? I don't really care about the frou-frou. I want to figure out what is absolutely the cleanest and fastest path. The thing that they've heard repeatedly is KISS. Keep it simple, stupid.
Of course,
right? There's just a lot of kind of learnings from engineering, how to keep things simple, how to keep things scalable. Right.
Yeah.
Like that's why we did what we did with our DMT asset, for example, way back when. It's like, how do you get something that patients are going to deal with well, that doctors are going to deal with well, that is easy to manufacture, kind of schlep around. That's where we went with the oral transmucosal film.
Yeah.
We could have gone with needles. We could have gone with a lot of other things. But it's like, we're trying to optimize for uptake. We're trying to optimize for scalability. Originally, we had digital therapeutics as part of that as well. We have prioritized that a little bit just based on where the field has gone. But it was always about how we can make this scalable. How can we make this an actual product that people will take, the doctors can work with?
Yeah. Now, we're jumping around a little bit, but I'm too curious not to go there. When you think about your DMT asset, surely there must be some trade-offs in pursuing this route of administration. How did you think about those trade-offs?
Well, the biggest trade-off is that it's very difficult to work with, right? I mean, to actually design it and then make it in a scalable fashion is not easy. I mean, to make something that is injected is trivial in the grand scheme of things. And if a drug is orally bioavailable, there's lots of expertise with that. But these oral thin films, as they're known, are much more niche. And there's not that many companies that really do that. So we went after it knowing that it was going to be hard. We had a good group of people that were working on it, and frankly, the results that we got recently exceeded expectations by a pretty significant margin. It turned out to be much better at delivering drug than we anticipated.
Wow.
So that's always the challenge, right? So depending on the moiety itself, it might work, but it might not get there. It might not get enough into the body.
Yeah.
And we did knocked it out of the park. Yeah. It's really good.
Tell me about that a little bit more. So you went in with a set of hypotheses. How have those updated?
Well, some of the core hypotheses have actually been borne out. So the core hypothesis was that we want something that fits into an existing paradigm, namely Spravato.
Gotcha.
So that was the pragmatic element that we talked about, right? There's already a company called J&J that's got lots of dollars behind it.
Yeah.
If anybody, you might have heard of them. If anybody can do the heavy lifting in terms of establishing a commercial infrastructure, it's them.
Right.
So take something let's make something that can more or less get dragged and dropped into the infrastructure that they've created, that they will create. Now, this was a couple of years ago, and it was doing okay, but not quite there. But of course, now Spravato is doing very well. A blockbuster this year based on run rate. So, and they've got 4,500 clinics set up. And it was a heavy lift. Because even they stumbled out of the gate. And they had to learn a lot, and they were able to do it. But a smaller company would have folded in that process. But now we can ride their coattails. So that 2-hour window was absolutely critical.
Gotcha.
That is something that we went after, and I'm very happy that we did that. Obviously looked for short-acting compounds. We went with DMT versus 5-methoxy-DMT because there was more data around it. I don't think there was one additional study that was conducted with DMT that actually did show good efficacy. So at least that has been borne out as well.
One of the things that also came up as I was doing the research was how it sounds like you're always taking kind of like the commercial kind of like maybe to use your terms, kind of like pragmatic lens on like how does this actually bear out in the real world? Is that like, are you concerned at all about how maybe some of your contemporaries are approaching this in the way that you've designed it relative to others?
I mean, in terms of the key players, I think there's different approaches and different views. I mean, clearly. Obviously, we know Beckley very well. We've taken a stake in them. We definitely appreciated their approach to things, which is why we decided to take that stake. Others are looking at, multiple inhalations and things of that nature. I was just aware of the FDA's reticence around things going into one's lungs.
I
had experience by proxy. Essentially, we had at a previous company, we had a collaboration with a company called Alexa that actually did inhaled product. A single administration in your lifetime, most likely. It's called, I don't remember the trade name, but it was essentially inhaled loxapine. Loxapine is an atypical. So when someone comes into the emergency room and they're agitated, you could use this instead of injecting them or something. So you basically kind of breathe it in. FDA made them jump through so many hoops. So many hoops. That's why I did not want anything that went into the lungs. So that was kind of a pragmatic consideration. I know about, in general, having very rapid rate of rise, very rapid PK for a compound that is getting into the brain, can be problematic. It can result in tolerability issues. It can result in a lot of different, a lot of things that can be concerning, including like with 5-methoxy-DMT, sometimes a PTSD-like syndrome can occur. So I didn't want that. So I kind of had an idea around the sort of PK that I wanted. And again, VLS-01 does hit that. BPL-003, the Beckley asset, also seems to have it. So I mean, I don't know. It's just some of it is kind of having some experience with CNS drugs previously, but also having experience with inhaled. Also, just kind of understanding being a physician, been in on that side of it. Have a pretty good sense of what's going to work. Fortunately, at previous jobs, had a lot of commercial experience as well. So I can kind of fold that in. That viewpoint.
One of the things that maybe an outside-in viewer might look at it, they might say, well, you've got this Beckley stake developing 5-MeO-DMT. You're developing your own DMT, both for treatment-resistant depression. Competitive in the portfolio, not competitive? How do you think about that?
I think there's a couple of ways to think about that. Pharmacologically, the two compounds are very different. So they're both obviously classical psychedelics, but there's a strong activity at the so-called 5-HT1A receptor with 5-methoxy-DMT that isn't there with DMT. Subjectively and anecdotally, people do say that there's differences in the experience of those two molecules. There's some compounds there that we can talk about. The reality is that it's unfortunately a very big space. There's lots of patients with treatment-resistant depression. And, everybody, you could sort of say all SSRIs are the same, but of course they're not. And the standard of care is to kind of rotate through. And people will respond to one and not the other. And the reason for that is that the pharmacology of each of these SSRIs is actually different. There are different, others, they all hit so-called SERT. That's what makes them serotonin reuptake inhibitors, but they hit other receptors, and that may be playing a role. Now, we don't know that, to be clear. And we don't know if you'll pick up different subsets of patients with DMT versus 5-methoxy-DMT. But I do know that that fundamental premise of possibly rotating is going to be, is absolutely going to be key. I think all that's going to be pretty important. Now, the other way to think about it, again, going back to the size of this population, is right now it's on the order of 50,000 patients, I believe, that are treated on a regular basis with Spravato.
Right.
That's giving you a $1 billion run rate.
Yeah.
And there are several million
15
patients.
million, or that's
With treatment-resistant depression, it's about, depending on the estimates, on 3 million or so. I mean, it's a huge patient population. There's lots of room for different approaches.
Yeah.
Again, more pragmatically, some people will not like inhale. Some people may not like the thing in the mouth because, who knows?
Right.
They may have different subjective effects that they don't like one or the other. So we'll see.
Regardless, you're taking a bet on the shorter duration.
100%.
Yeah. And you want to diversifying there.
Yeah. For depression, we think that's really a good approach because of J&J.
Yeah. So specifically for depression, you're taking this bet.
Yes.
You're not taking this bet elsewhere.
We are not. So we are developing RMDMA in the form of EMP-01.
Right.
We recently announced that we're pursuing social anxiety disorder with that.
Right. Exciting.
Yeah, no, very exciting. And we are also developing Ibogaine. Ibogaine is for substance use disorders in general. We're developing for opioid use disorder.
Right.
So those both have much longer effects. I think when all is said and done, RMDMA will be more or less like a psilocybin type thing in terms of duration, total duration. Ibogaine is longer. There's no doubt about that. It is, but it's a different environment. It's a different environment where where it's going to be delivered. It's inpatient detox facilities, essentially.
Yeah.
So just a different endpoint there.
Sure. Now, before we dive into social anxiety disorder, one of the things I had to ask, Jazz Singh from Neuropharmacology.
Nice to meet you. Jazz.
He wanted me to kind of follow up and ask, how do you think about long-term effect, maintenance? It sounds like you're envisioning a world where folks may be cycling on and off. How do you see that?
Well, I'm going to throw that back at Jazz. No,
I'm seeing it.
No, I mean, how do you think? How does it work with Spravato? I mean, generally, the idea is to get the person into remission.
Right.
That's what that initial sequence is all about. And then use it on a PRN basis, on an as-needed basis after that, because depression, all of these indications are chronic. I mean, opioid use disorder, certainly, they're all chronic. I don't view any of this as a cure. I mean, there'll be some subset of individuals which will take the initial sequence and be functionally cured. They won't have depression again. That is undoubtedly going to be the minority because, the patient has a life, they have their stressors, and that's going to likely precipitate another round of depression or what have you. So the idea is exactly that. They get them into remission, and then as things deteriorate, when they deteriorate, either go back to that, go back to a single dose, go back to a couple of doses, get them back in remission, let them stay there.
Yeah.
That's how I envision it. That is more or less what has happened with Spravato. Yeah.
Do you have any early inklings on development of treatment resistance or anything like this in this category? Yeah, unfortunately we don't. There's just it's so nascent, right? I mean, really, we have one good trial, and that is Compass. Yeah. That is our one good trial. Yeah. I mean, we obviously had the 12-week data from that, but that was really it. The phase 3 program that Compass has ongoing now is going to be very informative. So their first phase 3 will be reading out soon. The 6-week endpoint is going to be what it is. I mean, I'm really interested in seeing what happens after that. Right. Yeah. Right. What percentage of people get the redose? How does it look on the redose? Yeah. Their second phase 3 trial is also going to be very interesting because there they do actually do 2 doses. Right. So it's 2 doses, 3 weeks apart, and then primary at 6 weeks. Yeah. That's going to be really intriguing. I am curious to see what the incremental benefit is and what that means for time to relapse. I think it's going to be incredible. Yeah, it seems like there's a lot of magic happening in the 6 to 9 month window there. Other people are waiting to see. We're all waiting to see that. It's just early days. Yeah. The second part-hitting question for you. Spoke to Glenn before this as well. And Glenn wanted to know your opinion on whether the kind of magic is happening in the subjective experience or potentially isolating the neuroplastic effects. and how I know the two of you have debated this on it.
We have. I mean, the way I think about it is, again, pragmatically, simple-mindedly, right? It's just, there are two phenomena that are occurring. One is neuroplasticity, which we all talk about, but there's also network disruption. That network disruption is manifesting as the psychedelic experience. But it is alteration in how the networks in your brain are functioning for that period of time in the context of profound neuroplasticity.
Right.
That's probably, right now, that's what I view as the key.
The interplay.
Yes, because I can envision a scenario where there's lots of network disruption that doesn't result in the absence of neuroplasticity that then just kind of goes away.
No change.
Right. So I can so cannabinoids are a good example, right? Because cannabinoids cause all sorts of network disruption, and there's hallucinatory type behaviors that can occur there. But there isn't thought to be this marked release of, growth factors.
Right.
And you don't get persistent beneficial effects.
Right.
And the converse is interesting, right? I mean, this one is more of a thought experiment, but I can certainly see that I give you something that is profoundly neuroplastic. And in the context of therapy, that could be great, right? So you get, you take something, gives you an hour of neuroplasticity, you go in and actually do some exhaustive therapy.
Right.
Interpersonal.
Yeah.
I could see that being beneficial. Conversely, I can see someone taking that, going out driving a car, having a car accident, and that having a profoundly adverse impact. Right? Because for the same reason, and those are two extremes. There's the intermediate one that gives me pause, and that is, you're depressed. You have ruminative thoughts that are negative. I give you this compound. And now you set those ruminative thoughts into even more, you really firm those up in your brain. Not great. So, I mean, these are thought experiments. And we don't know the answer. And I guess we'll start getting some of those data. I know Delix is a company that's working on the non-psychedelic, non-hallucinatory compounds. I think their readout, they have a phase 2, but it's, I want to say a year from now or something, somewhere in that ballpark. So we'll see. And there was some conjecture that those drugs do have subjective effects, nonetheless. And the question is that truly psychedelic? Is it hallucinatory? I have no idea.
And do they interplay enough in order to...
Exactly.
Fascinating. Well, now you're on the record. And Glenn will hold you to it.
Not a problem.
Perfect.
Until there's more data, I'm going to stick with that.
Of course. You never know. Hey, you started to touch on your social anxiety disorder program. Maybe just start with how did you start looking at this as an indication? Because I know that there hasn't been a tremendous amount of work done in SAD.
Well, that's one of the reasons we started looking at it.
Fair enough.
Right? Social anxiety disorder is very prevalent, and it is quite impactful for the patients to have it. It wasn't really front and center until COVID. And COVID had a marked influence on social anxiety, even in adults, but particularly in younger individuals. I mean, I can speak to this personally. I had 3 kids that were, they were all in high school when that started, when they got hit with COVID. And it was really tough on them. Because they lost these important windows of socialization. They're still recovering, quite frankly, and they're not alone. So it has moved into more prominence because of COVID, but it's still where depression was maybe 10 years ago. So there's old stuff that was approved. There's 2 SSRIs and an SNRI that were approved 20 years ago. That's it. Therapy works great. Everybody says that. Therapy works great for TRD, but it's difficult to implement. So that's not all that helpful. So that's one of the reasons that we got intrigued by the indication. Now, there was a little bit of data around social anxiety disorder. It is a prominent symptom in autism, right? It's not quite the same as it is in neurotypical, but there's certainly overlap. And there was a small study that was conducted with MDMA. So that was kind of intriguing, robustly positive results. But the results that we got with our MDMA is where we started. It was so differentiated and so unexpected compared to MDMA, that's what kind of got us thinking, where else could we take it? And there are a couple of things that were notable. First, we were looking at something called the emotional breakthrough inventory. And not surprisingly, it's a measure of emotional breakthroughs when you feel like you kind of overcome an internal hurdle. And what we found is an incredible dose response across the dose range. We tested 5 different doses. So that's when I get excited.
Probably.
Yeah, I mean, in a phase 1, you have small n. Yeah. You're looking at a bunch of different things. They're all exploratory. When you see beautiful dose responses, that's when things get really intriguing. So we saw that emotional breakthroughs have been correlated with efficacy, particularly with psilocybin in depression, but also in other affective disorders, including anxiety. So that was the first thing that got us intrigued. Then there was a measure. We did this measure of self-compassion.
Yeah.
And self-compassion has adversely impacted a number of mental health conditions, right? Being this internal harsh critic can be problematic in depression, but it seems to play a very prominent role in social anxiety. I mean, this harsh internal critic is one of the reasons you feel socially inadequate. In a subset of patients, I don't want to overgeneralize, but certainly in a subset of patients that can play a role. So that was intriguing. And then beyond that, this compound we looked at this measure called the 5-DAC, which is the nature and the intensity of psychedelic experience. And this compound looked a lot like a psychedelic on this measure and not like MDMA, which was intriguing. And it was a much more inwardly focused thing. But in the details, it was different than a normal psychedelic. I mean, there's a subscale around visual restructuralization, and normally that refers to the hallucinations that one sees. But in the case of this compound, patients are saying, or subjects in this case, or healthy volunteers, are saying that they were able to view their life differently. That's a whole different level, right? Of a person's just seeing this stuff on the wall differently. You know what I mean? So it's a really intriguing compound. And, we could still pursue PTSD with this. We had certainly talked about it initially, but SAD is such a prominent issue and there's no one else pursuing it. There's one other company that's looking at a compound for acute administration where you're going in a situation where you're going to be anxious, but this could be more profound.
Maybe just for the audience, MDMA, RMDMA, what's the difference? How should they be thinking about that?
So that's a great question. So there's multiple compounds or drugs on the market that consist of 2 different molecules. And these molecules are like your hands. They're mirror images of each other. They don't superimpose. And just, it's not so easy to stick your right hand into your left glove. It's the same thing with molecules and their receptors. So taking the right-handed equivalent molecule, it's going to fit into its right-handed receptor. But not so much in the other side. So there's different pharmacology. Now, many times, one of the enantiomers just doesn't have any activity. But in many cases, they actually do, and they're very different. And in the case of MDMA, the S enantiomer is actually much more like a stimulant. So it causes dopamine release, norepinephrine release. It really amps you up. And the other enantiomer, RMDMA, is much more serotonergic.
Oh, wow.
And so the initial conjecture was that by getting rid of the amphetamine-like properties, we could maybe get all of the benefits, which are thought to be serotonergic, all of the so-called entactogenic properties in a compound with much better safety and tolerability.
Wow.
So that was the initial hypothesis. Because if you look at MDMA, there are problems with it. It causes pretty marked blood pressure increases. It's the element that pharmacology is associated with some kind of abuse potential. Whereas purely serotonergic typically is not.
Interesting.
So that was another element. You do see other phenomena. You see hyperthermia. It's basically you get a fever in many situations when you take MDMA, and that can be dangerous. And then there's bruxism, which, it's basically grinding your teeth. There was some data suggested that could be from the dopamine as well and the norepinephrine as well. So these were all the reasons that we decided to go after that one. But then when we actually tested it, as I mentioned, the results were very different.
Fascinating. Now I know that classic MDMA may not be categorized as a it's like classic psychedelic drinks. But you suggested that RMDMA may also have a little bit of this subjective experience. How do you think about that?
In the phase one,
Sure.
subject to replication, in phase one, it certainly behaved very much like a psychedelic,
Interesting.
with some differences, as I mentioned, right? So it was somewhat in between.
Right.
I think from the perspective of safety, et cetera, it was a very inward focused experience. So the one of the challenges, well, the potential benefit, but also the challenge with MDMA is that it's externally focused. That's why it's a drug of abuse, right? In the sense that why do people take it when going to a rave?
Right.
That's why. So we had therapists that actually were familiar with MDMA. They had been therapists in the context of MDMA as well. And they said this was very different. The subjects were internal.
Yeah.
They were doing their own thing. They were quiet, as opposed to talking and trying to externalize. I mean, a big part of what the therapist is doing when someone's on MDMA is saying, go back inside, right? Go back inside. Yeah. That was not an issue here.
Wow. And is that hinting at maybe like a little bit of trial design, I guess, benefit of not needing psychotherapy as an assist?
Certainly. So in all of the classical psychedelic instances, there's really no true space for therapy while the patient is on the compound itself.
Right.
Now, one can debate how much therapy is actually needed or useful when a subject is on MDMA as well, other than redirecting. Right. We've never anticipated anything. It's really much more about safety, etc. Which is actually no different in some sense than esketamine or ketamine, right? Because there are perceptual distortions that occur with those compounds. The patient may very much feel out of sorts, right? They're kind of psychedelic light in many ways. But so you do need someone to keep an eye on to make sure things aren't going sideways. They can have reactions that are very anxiogenic, right?
Yeah.
And they need to be settled down.
Yeah.
That can happen with all of these compounds. So there needs to be someone monitoring the patients, but we never anticipated therapy occurring. Now we do view there is an importance to the prep work. This is a very unusual experience to someone that's uninitiated.
Yeah.
Right? We're prepping for the real world. We're prepping for where most people haven't taken these compounds, right? As opposed to more, true believers, et cetera. It's a very unusual experience, and you need to prep the patient for it. And you need to give them some skills in case things become challenging, because they can. So that's what we want to do in the prep work. And then afterwards, I want to make sure that there's psychological safety. Stuff may have come up. So we know that can happen. Things that hadn't been repressed, any number of things can come up. And you want to make sure that the patient is adequately taken care of. Some people will require it, many people won't. And that's fine. But you want to make sure the patient is psychologically stable. It's kind of like, if the patient comes back the next day and says, you know what, I had a little bit of chest pain when we were doing this. We were you're going to refer them out, right? You're going to do an ECG. You're probably going to get a cardiology and so on. Same thing, right? That's medical stability. This is psychological stability.
What does great pre-work and post-work look like in this context?
Well, I think a big part of it is, as I outlined, really making sure the subject understands what they're getting into. Right? And this is more conjecture, so, let me label it as such, but there is a notion of suggestibility with these experiences, right? So if you go in being very scared and thinking about other things, that may very well come up during the experience. May not, but it may, right? Again, going back to thought experiments, I probably wouldn't want to give this compound if you, on the way over to the doctor's office, had a car accident, or you just broke up with your
got some bad news or something.
Significant other, whatever, whatever, right? You probably don't want to do it then, because that may actually make for a much more challenging experience and not necessarily in a good way, right? So I think making sure that the subject understands what they're getting into, is focusing on what they want to get out of it. That is definitely more anecdotal at this point. But I could sort of see how that might be good. If you have the things that you want to work on kind of front of mind, there's a possibility that may be beneficial. That needs to be confirmed for what it's worth.
Now, are the clinical staff meeting the patients and going, well, like, how bad was your day?
Well, I mean, generally speaking, yes. I mean, what is their mental, where are they? If they are really looking pretty rattled, maybe you want to not do this. So yeah, I mean, in a general sense, absolutely. Okay. And then finally, some of the things I was telling you about, stuff may come up that is challenging during the experience. Just learning how to breathe. Yeah. Right. Mm-hmm. I mean, the therapist may say at that point, just remember what we talked about, box breathing as an example. Counting to 4 on the inhale, 4 hold, 4 on the exhale, etc. Let's go try and do that. Yeah. Or just take a deep breath, hold, and let go. Just having them practice some of these skills prior can just give them some additional psychological safety. Right. So, I mean, I think that's what good looks like until we know more. I mean, maybe the prep work is not that critical. I don't know. But right now, the anecdotes are there, and they are that. So let's kind of run with that. Now, in terms of the follow-up, stuff does come up, and maybe exploring some of that can be useful. Mm-hmm. Like, what can you describe about the experience? It might jog some things that might be useful for therapy afterwards. Yeah. It would definitely be useful for understanding if the patient if there's any concerns around psychological safety.
Mm-hmm. You're just kind of scanning for anything that
exactly
could have come up.
Exactly. Yeah. Exactly. Just, patient safety is front and center.
Of course, always. Yeah. Now, the last thing I wanted to know about SAD is just, given there isn't a lot of work that's been done, how do you even go about approaching trial design, endpoint selection, anything like that whole set of questions?
Well, there is a regulatory endpoint because there were 3 drugs that were approved. So there's something called the Lewy Social Anxiety Scale. FDA is very comfortable with it. And there have been some recent programs that have used that as well, that had, that have kind of re-upped, if you will, and made sure that the FDA is comfortable with it. Yeah. So that's what we're looking at. I mean, we're looking at some other things as well, but certainly it's a good place to start. Yeah. The trial in question is really proof of concept. It's an early stage trial. So really trying to see how the patients respond to the drug and how they, what kind of a signal we're getting. Right. So it'll really help guide and inform the next trial in particular. But, it's early days for that one.
Yeah. Can I take you to the next one in your portfolio here? Of course. Let's talk about cognitive impairment for schizophrenia. Yeah. And looking at the portfolio, one might say schizophrenia feels a little bit different than anxiety, depression. Yeah. How did you end up there?
Well, so when Atai was, we talked a little bit about Atai's model and transitioning to an operating company, we had a pretty broad mandate across mental health disorders. And we had a pretty broad mandate in terms of the business model as well. So we were doing we were doing investments. We had a stake ultimately in a public company in the form of Compass. But, again, we were taking, majority stakes in a number of these academic small startup companies as well. Again, really broad across mental health. Yeah. And Pragmatic, which is the company that's got the RL-007, was an example of that. Uh-huh. Really fascinating compound, very unusual compound that was phenotypically characterized. I mean, most drugs these days are pharmacologically characterized. We talked about 5-HT2A agonists. That's pharmacological characterization of the drug. This drug was put into a lot of animal studies and shown to basically they showed low doses pro-cognitive, high doses analgesic. Mm-hmm. And that's it. Didn't hit any of the usual receptor screens. Mm-hmm. And then they did some additional works in the pro-cognitive settings and the analgesic settings. You could put antagonists in and you could sort of see that, you put a GABA B antagonist in, it seems to go away. The benefits go away. So you can surmise what the pharmacology is, but it wasn't direct. Right. And then there was all these clinical studies that actually showed pro-cognitive effects. There was 3 at that time. Right. So you put it all together, it's like, wow, that's a really interesting compound. Yeah. And there's a huge unmet medical need in cognitive impairment and schizophrenia. That is literally ubiquitous in folks with schizophrenia. Yeah. It's just an issue of when it becomes impactful. Yeah. If you were supposed to have an IQ of 150 and you lose 2 sigma or 3 sigma, you're doing okay. Right. Yeah. You're just fine. Yeah. If you are normal or below normal and you lost 2 or 3 sigma, or each one of the sigma there's 10 points, you're impacted and adversely impacted. So that's how to think about it.
Yeah.
So it's 85% of people are impacted. It is one of the major drivers of institutionalization, et cetera. Of the disability, the cost associated with the patients. That's a major driver.
Yeah.
So anything that we can do to even incrementally benefit the patient is going to be huge.
Yeah.
It's going to be huge. So I anticipate this ideally in the context of some kind of occupational therapy. If it can kind of bend the trajectory of the patient over time.
Right.
It doesn't have to, it's like with there was these models for the meteor or an asteroid, in this case, coming towards the Earth.
Yeah.
You just put a small rocket booster on it and you just do it for a long time.
Right.
You can change the trajectory. Even that is fantastic for this population if you can just change it.
Absolutely. Now, maybe talk to me a little bit about why start with schizophrenia per se. I know that cognitive impairment presents itself in a variety of other indications. One would say schizophrenia might be the hardest to kind of do this research on. Why start there?
That's why.
Okay.
It was
okay. No, okay. I love it.
It was hard.
Yeah. Do the hard thing first.
Yeah, it's hard. And that's what caused a lot of people to shy away.
Yeah.
But the need is so big, and it behooves us to go after that and see if we can help those patients. I mean, in the best of all possible worlds, you do a couple of different trials. Yeah, that would be fantastic.
Fair. Yeah.
It was outside of our mandate. It still is outside of our mandate to think about Alzheimer's and things. Yeah. But dementias of different sorts would be great. Right. It'd be wonderful to try a couple of different things. There is more heterogeneity in some of those indications than there is in schizophrenia, which is not, schizophrenia is heterogeneous, but there may be a little less there. And certainly some aspects of the pharmacology of this drug do tie in to some degree the underlying deficits that can be seen in schizophrenia. So there's very broadly some alterations in inhibition versus excitation in the brains of folks with schizophrenia. This drug is impacting one aspect of that, the inhibitory side. And all the drugs that are being pursued for this indication at this point, they're either glutamatergic or they're GABAergic, so in excitation or inhibition.
I love the kind of framing of we're doing it because it's hard. One of the things we say at Power is that if it was easy, there wouldn't be an opportunity there.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Exactly.
Totally. Everything that's worth doing is probably hard right now.
Yes.
Yeah.
Yes.
Totally.
That's right.
Now, I want to zoom up a little bit here.
Sure.
We've kind of taken a quick scan through the portfolio: treatment-resistant depression, social anxiety disorder, cognitive impairment associated with schizophrenia. How do you think about portfolio construction writ large?
So, I mean, again, it's been an organic process at Atai, right? So it was a broader portfolio for a very long time, and again, a diversity of models there. We've obviously slimmed that down pretty significantly over time, and a lot of that was really organic, right? So we did have some negative results. We had very high bars for
things not working.
Yeah, things didn't work, and that's okay. That's that's the normal course. What we didn't do was replace. Right. So there was a realization that, big is complex, and complex is obviously, well, it's complex. It's hard to manage at times. So going back to one of my organizing principles, which is KISS, it's like, all right, let's really try to simplify this down. We've got a really nice portfolio at this point. I think there's really good drugs, good approaches at this point, complementary things in depression, something that is orthogonal with RMDMA, different pharmacologically than everything else that's being developed, different indication. Right. I like that. There's a number of different psychedelics that fundamentally are all, have a lot of similarities. I said that the market size is big, and that's true. Yeah. But having something that's going in a different direction is also nice. And then, of course, there's ibogaine as well. Yeah. Which we didn't talk about, and then, of course, RL-007 is completely different. So I think we're in a pretty good place. We're well funded to get these phase 2 readouts, everything that we've talked about. So certainly the LS01, the MP01, RL-007, which is ongoing. So all of these phase 2 trials are either about to be initiated, but all of them are covered. Will read out over the course of the next year-ish. Yeah. So pretty good place from that perspective.
Yeah. And tell me a little bit about the maybe desire not to replace at all, right? I again, keep it simple. But any temptation here to tuck another one in?
There's always temptation.
Of course, yeah.
There's always temptation. There's always, you start thinking about, and this gets back to actually, I think what Glenn had mentioned.
Right.
It's easy. I love doing that, right?
Yeah.
I love the creative element. I like blue skying, and I like coming up with, cool new ideas with the team, right? But, in the end, you've got a finite amount of resources. There's only so many people in the company, and we got to focus on where we are and, what's going to be the most meaningful in terms of inflection points, so that we can continue to raise money to continue to develop the drugs and make sure they get to people as quickly as possible.
Mm-hmm.
So
now I've got to ask, when I look at your portfolio versus maybe some of the others, I see a mix of psychedelic, non-psychedelic work. Was that always the vision to kind of do a broader? Tell me about that. Yeah.
Yeah. Initially, it was broader.
Yeah.
Obviously, again, over time, just because for a range of reasons, we've kind of pulled that in a bit.
Yeah.
And there's some other benefits as well. So we have focused on. There's some other nice things about psychedelics, and that is that they're what I refer to as a tractable commercial problem, if you will, right? So if you think about a normal SSRI or something like that, it is a lot. You have to hit a lot of doctors. So when you think about commercial scalability, it's tough, right? Because there's 25,000-ish psychiatrists and physicians that sort of function like psychiatrists to actually reach all of those doctors with the sales force is a big undertaking. It's a 2,500, 3,000 person sales force versus, I said 4,500 clinics so far, even if that doubles.
Yeah.
This is a much more, this is a much smaller kind of sales force. Could be okay. I mean, my understanding is even J&J is like no more than 100, maybe 200 sales reps.
Yeah.
That's what I envision here.
Yeah.
And we now have some synergies, right? So it's difficult to justify sometimes the cost of a sales force with just one product.
Yeah.
But now that we have more than one, it actually starts to work.
Yeah.
Assuming that we're fortunate enough to have more than one of these get to market.
Yeah.
Right? But if that happens where you start to see some real financial synergies there.
Yeah.
So again, kind of keeping that in mind as well.
Yeah. And the goal is to grow the commercial org once you get there.
I mean, if the appropriate opportunity happens, then
Sure.
But yes, I mean, I would love to take this forward into the commercial space ourselves. Part of it's pragmatic, retain as much of the economic upside as possible.
And not closing any doors today.
No, of course not. We're too early in this game.
Right.
So
yeah. Now, maybe the last kind of set of questions here. I'll just hear you talk a little bit about the transition to CEO and how you think about that.
Well, I mean, I've had the role in previous companies. I've been basically very much a startup person all the way through. It's been Florian and I for the last, 5 years.
Yeah.
Right. So, and we've had these discussions all the way through about co-CEO. Even around the IPO, I pushed. I was like, that's kind of weird. Let's not do that. Right. So, because, we brought very different skills, very complementary skills.
Right.
And very different, very complementary personality styles. So it's been a fantastic journey with Florian. And we, very proud of what we built together. But as the portfolio is as the company's turned into more of a traditional pipeline play, it just makes more sense to kind of winnow it, you don't necessarily need all of that, the acumen on the business side, which is really critical for all this, with this complex business model.
Yeah.
So, it makes sense.
Yeah.
I've always been involved in many of the CEO type functions as well, like all at fundraising, all of that has always been basically for Florian and myself. Got a good team behind me. Everybody knows me,
right? Yeah.
Which certainly helps.
Yeah.
You know what I mean? So, I mean, as far as transitions go, I think this one's a pretty nice one. And of course, there's been a good overlap period as well to really kind of properly, hand off responsibilities.
Totally. So looking into the future, what are you most excited to continue investing in?
I mean, the portfolio that we talked about, right? So we'll have some really good readouts over the course of the next, year to 18 months.
Yeah.
And that's obviously that's going to drive where we head next. But I like the multiple opportunities here. We've got a lead, we've got something that's behind that. Actually, I guess in this case, there's sort of two leads. One, it's psychedelic, and the other one, non-psychedelic. But I think that those readouts will help really define the company and change, will obviously define the course after the next 12 to 18 months.
Yeah. And outside of your own readouts, what are you most closely watching?
Well, Compass, obviously.
Of course, yeah.
Compass, obviously. But, there's quite a few. I mean, we've got GH Research. I mean, their 5-methoxy DMT readout coming up. Simon has a GAD readout that's coming up. Reunion has one in postpartum depression. So there's a few that are coming up. I mentioned Delix already from the non-health side. So lots of opportunities in the other indications. So definitely watching those is several outside of the space as well. I mean, there's a lot of activity in depression. I think,
absolutely.
Again, unfortunately, there's lots of unmet medical need. But that's one of the reasons that I'm really intrigued by in going into some other indication.
Of course.
SAD, so.
Yeah. Not much has been done for many years.
Yeah. So finding other indications. Of course, the psychedelics potentially have utility outside of depression, obviously, right? So we're looking at other indications and thinking about other things for these compounds as well. So
any hints?
No, I mean, nothing is far enough along to really say. I mean, right now our heads are down on getting these trials off course running and executed. But obviously we do continue to do commercial assessments and watch other parties, and it'll be, it's going to be a little bit of time before we make any decisions around that. I want to see some solid phase 2 results first.
Of course.
And then, raise money for it, get the phase 3 program going and start thinking about other phase 2s.
All very sensible.
Pragmatic, baby.
Yeah, no, that's right.
Got a problem to solve.
That'll be the title of the podcast.
That's right.
Pragmatic, baby.
That's right.
My last question is magic wand. You got a magic wand, you can change anything about how research gets done in neuropsychiatry. What are you changing?
Dear God, the placebo effect.
Oh my gosh, yeah.
It's funny to go back and look at some of the old clinical studies, right? And, they're more like normal studies, right? I mean, there's small placebo effect. There's really good response with the drugs. The trial sizes aren't very big.
Right.
And just seeing where that has changed, how that's changed. And of course, the entire space has changed. It's more complex and there's many more layers within it, with different kind of, the sites and then the CROs and how they all interact and all the, there's just a lot of different layers at this point. But I think that's the big challenge to the space.
Yeah.
You sometimes look wistfully at some of the other indications with very hard endpoints, like obesity, for example.
Yeah.
It's like,
sure.
Well, it's pretty easy. It's very hard. There is a placebo effect, believe it or not, but it's not very robust, and it's not like this, and it's not, you've got a very hard endpoint. So I think that's the biggest challenge. I mean, of course, biomarkers and things of that nature are very challenging. They're not robust. They won't be robust for a while. You've got to ask the patient, right?
Yeah.
So
I'm okay. I got to ask the follow-up question.
Yeah.
It sounds like the placebo effect has gone more pronounced.
It has.
Take us into that a little bit. What do you think is going on?
Oh, there's many papers that have been written on this one. I don't know. I mean, again, part of it is what I alluded to, that I think the field has changed. The patients have changed. The doctors have changed. I think, it's much more industrial at this point. A lot of patients will say what the docs want to hear. There's professional patients that are involved in multiple things. There's the phenomenon of, patients, in their chat forum. There's huge chat rooms that are around this that trying to take apart what's going on with your trial and figure out what they're on and whether or not, so there's just a lot of different phenomena that's changed over, say, maybe more than 20 years. I mean, certainly 30 years ago, the trials were very different.
Yeah.
So I don't know how to, there's so many people who spent so much time trying to figure out how to make this better. And really nothing is for improvement.
Lots of papers, something conclusive.
Nothing conclusive. Nothing conclusive. It's an interesting phenomenon.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah.
Well, there you have it. No more placebo response.
That'd be great. 10 patients study. No.
Make it a lot easier for you, I'm sure.
Yeah, it would.
Yeah. Well, Srini, thank you so much for taking the time to have this conversation.
Yeah, it's my pleasure.
This was brilliant. I really appreciate it.
Really enjoyed it.
That was a great time.